morning to you. Welcome to Breakfast with Dan Walker and Louise Minchin.
Headlines for you at 8 o'clock this morning. The government calls for an agreement to be reached today over increased coronavirus restrictions in Greater Manchester as it prepares to offer the city region tens of millions of pounds.
Wales on the verge of a short national lockdown described as a firebreak against coronavirus, and announcements due to be made today.
Good morning. Yeah, it was set to be a bumper October for the Lake District and other UK holiday destinations, but the tier system means that cancellations are up. Half-term holiday nightmares for thousands of businesses. What does it mean for your trip?
How a dip in cold water has proved to be a promising lead in the search to find a cure for dementia.
Good morning. This week we're looking at some unsettled weather. There'll be some heavy rain at times, some strong winds, but the first half at least is going to be milder than we'd expect at this time of year. I'll have all the details in 10 minutes.
Good morning, it's Monday, it's the 19th of October. Top story for you today. The Community Secretary, Robert Jenrick, has told this programme a conclusion needs to be reached today with leaders in Greater Manchester about moving into the highest level of coronavirus restrictions.
The government has spent the last few days in a standoff with the region's mayor, Andy Burnham, who fears that the measures will cause severe economic harm. Let's speak to our political correspondent, Ian Watson, who I know was listening to that. What do you make of what Mr Jenrick had to say?
Well, it's interesting that the negotiations will continue, Louise, not just with Robert Jenrick, the Community Secretary, but one of the most senior officials in Downing Street, Edward Lister. Downing Street very keen to get an agreement with Greater Manchester. They don't want to impose these tighter restrictions there without local agreement, partly because they'd be worried about how they'd be enforced or how people would comply if they're seen to be going over people's heads. So they're very keen to reach agreement, and Robert Jenrick, when he was asked on this programme earlier about how soon that could happen, he seemed to think we might get a breakthrough in the next 48 hours.
The number of cases remains at a seriously high level across Greater Manchester and in particular in some parts of the region. ICU capacity is uncomfortably high. We do now need to take action. And so I hope that we can reach agreement, but one way or another, we need to draw this to a conclusion, put in place the measures that are necessary and move forward in Greater Manchester in the next day or two.
Now, obviously, some money might be able to grease the wheels here. It was interesting that Robert Jenrick also was talking about the level of financial support available in Liverpool, which has agreed to these tighter restrictions. That's around £40 million for a region of 1.5 million people. In Greater Manchester, it's just under 3 million people. So we could see perhaps 75, maybe £80 million on the table. The question, though, is how much of that could be used for the things which the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, believes are essential. For example, topping up wages in a more generous way than the government's national scheme if people are forced to see their businesses close. Also, could there be money there to help local residents shield again if there's a threat in Greater Manchester? What's also interesting, though, is that Robert Jenrick ruled out the idea of a short, sharp national circuit breaker, national lockdown. We know that Wales are going to be introducing more stringent measures, probably to be announced around lunchtime today. But in England, a regional approach is still favoured by the government, and that does mean these negotiations with Greater Manchester and also separate negotiations with South Yorkshire today, each area hammering out its own separate deal. But of course, that may well delay the imposition of measures which the government believes are necessary.
Ian Watson, thank you very much for taking us through all of that. Thank you.
Dan Johnson is in Manchester for us this morning. So much discussion, Dan, good morning to you about exactly what's going to happen today. We've heard, I'm sure you were listening as well, to Robert Jenrick, which Ian's just been discussing. So what are leaders asking for there?
Good morning. Yes, they've been talking for more than a week now, and I think there is acceptance that something needs to happen, that something needs to change, and that extra measures will be needed because case numbers have kept rising, and as you heard, the number of people in hospital is reaching worrying levels. But the suspicion from local politicians here has been that those highest level of restrictions may not even be enough to be effective, and the feeling is, well, what's the point doing that if it's not even going to bring down the case numbers enough? There needs to be a properly tailored package that is going to be effective on the one hand for bringing case numbers under control, but also that looks after local people who will be affected if businesses have to close. And it's not just about the furlough payments that'll be available for those businesses and those workers directly affected if pubs, bars, restaurants, gyms are told to close. It's also about the other people who work in hospitality and the service industry who will be affected indirectly as a knock-on if social life here is disrupted further and there is an interruption and lower numbers of people out and about. Those are the sorts of issues that local leaders have been raising and wanting money for. They're also talking about the cash to actually enforce these restrictions, because it's going to mean more pressure on council teams, the local police. How do they make sure that people are abiding by those restrictions? All that is up for debate today as these discussions continue.
Thank you, Dan. Good to talk to you.
In the meantime, a short lockdown across Wales, which has been described as a fire break lasting for 2 to 3 weeks, could be announced as early as this morning. Our correspondent Thomas Morgan is in Cardiff with the latest. And Thomas, what's expected?
So expecting the First Minister to make that announcement today. And it's looking more likely now that there will be a fire break in Wales, which will be a national lockdown, be a set period of duration for this national lockdown here for at least 2 weeks, so that the First Minister, as he says, can bring the virus back under control here in Wales. The numbers have been increasing, even though the majority of the country have been in a local lockdown in Wales for the past few weeks. Local lockdowns in Wales mean that nobody should be leaving their area by law or going into another area, which is different to England, where people are advised not to. But here, people are being fined and being turned home if they do break the law. Travel ban also came in last Friday, meaning that people coming in from hotspot areas, from other areas of the UK, also banned from visiting Wales now. So I think the government here decided that this is maybe the only other option they can do now to curb the spread of the virus in Wales as we get closer to Christmas, and as all the scientists suggest, we could be seeing another surge then. They're wanting to do this. The First Minister has mentioned a few times this is something he does want to see to curb that threat. And after this firebreaker happens, there will be another national lockdown set of rules, he says, so that we can continue in some sort of fashion to bring some sort of normality towards Christmas. But what this will mean, of course, it will be very similar to what we saw back in March, potentially, the closure of non-essential retail. And of course, we're hoping that schools, or we should be hearing that schools will remain open for the best part.
OK, Thomas, thank you.
Now, tougher coronavirus restrictions are being introduced in Italy after it announced a record number of new cases yesterday. Restaurant opening times will be limited, and town mayors will have the power to shut public squares from 9 o'clock in the evening. In Switzerland, face coverings must be worn in all public spaces from today. Ireland is preparing to announce restrictions which ministers say will be decisive and nationwide.
See the headlines as they happen and watch BBC News live in the app and get the full story with bbc.co.uk/news. Follow the story for all the latest with BBC News.